our topic tonight, you know, it starts, India has risen. I don't know if everybody reacted to that part of it the same way I did, but in any case, and beyond that, the strategic engagement with India. And of course, the President and the Secretary of State and others have all emphasized the importance of the developing partnership with India. And that's underlined by the fact that the President will be traveling to India. He also entertained their Prime Minister early in his tenure here. And it coincides with some very harsh things said about Pakistan within the last 10 days or so by members of the administration. So it's a fascinating period of time. And we know when the Indian ambassador was here, she very clearly alluded to India's quest for a greater role in global leadership. So there is the idea of strategic engagement is not a frivolous one. It appears very real and very, very interesting today. Our guest for the evening has headed the India-U.S. dialogue for the past several years, so is extraordinarily well placed with respect to that topic. Well, it's a wonderful topic. The Assistant Secretary is not only responsible for India, where he served as Deputy Chief of Mission at one time, but also for all those other interesting countries of the area, and shares the interests and concerns of Mr. Holbrooke, who is our special presidential representative in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Ambassador Blake was educated at Harvard. He has his master's degree from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington. Has been with the State Department since 1985. He was posted in North African countries, Tunisia, Egypt, Algeria, I believe. Also posted to Nigeria. And as I said, and I should mention, he was also the senior desk officer for Turkey. And he then was a executive assistant to the Undersecretary of State, and more recently then was DCM, Deputy Chief of Mission in India, another building block for this evening's program, and then as ambassador to Sri Lanka and the Maldives, before coming to his present post, Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asian Affairs. It's my great pleasure to present Ambassador Robert O. Blake.
Well, I have to thank you, Frank, for that very kind introduction. I'm looking around for an agent, so I may need to hire you. It's one of the kinder introductions I've received. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here today to speak to all of you at the Baltimore Council. I'm very surprised to see such a large number of people. I was teasing Frank that maybe he put like a door prize of a $100 bill under one of your seats or something to try to encourage all of you to come listen to somebody from the State Department. But it really is a treat to be here. I want to thank Frank for the lovely regatta that he put on in my honor. It's a sign of Baltimore hospitality here. In all seriousness, as Frank said, I'm responsible for all of the countries of South and Central Asia, so India and all the countries around India, and then the 5 stands of Central Asia. I'd be very glad to talk about that later on if you want, because there's a lot of very important things going on there. We just had a big election in Kyrgyzstan over the weekend, the first parliamentary elections in Central Asian history, the first elections, I like to say, that where the outcome was not known in advance, and therefore a very seminal event in Central Asian history. But again, quite a lot of very important things going on in that part of the world. And then our vision is that we hope eventually to be able to link these regions up, that we hope to have Central Asia be the pivot of a new Silk Road that would link the big markets of Russia and Western Europe with the oil and gas of Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan and to a certain extent Uzbekistan, and then the huge and growing markets of South Asia, India, and Pakistan, and Bangladesh, but also Sri Lanka and Nepal. And if we can get the Afghanistan and Pakistan piece of that right, it's a very compelling vision, and it's something we work on a lot. And we can talk more about that if all of you are interested. But today I really want to spend most of my time talking about India because, you know, this is a few short weeks, as Frank said, before President Obama is going to make what's going to be his longest overseas trip to any single country, and that is to India in early November. And I know that Ambassador Shankar, my friend, the Indian ambassador, spoke here a little while ago. So I'll try not to repeat too much of what she said, but in fact we often have we joke that we have quite similar remarks in terms of how we characterize things. But you know, why is India important to the United States? It's the world's largest democracy. It's one of the world's fastest growing economies right now, and it's a rising power in Asia and beyond. And more important, it has very vibrant democratic institutions. It has a free press, a robust civil society, and of great interest to many of you, a very innovative private sector. India's commitment to the values that are cherished by their people and espoused by their founders, democracy, pluralism, tolerance, openness, and respect for fundamental freedoms and human rights, continue to animate our joint efforts to build a more peaceful, prosperous, inclusive, secure, and sustainable world. That's a long sentence, but that sort of captures in a nutshell some of the things that we're trying to accomplish with India. And these common values, and I think our increasingly convergent interests, have driven a really unprecedented transformation in Indo-US relations in just the last 10 years. After the Cold War, President Clinton, at the very end of his time in office, seized upon India's rapid economic emergence and liberalization to lay the foundation for this transformation with a really important 5-day visit that he and his wife, now my boss, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, took to India in the year 2000. The Bush administration then built upon the Clinton legacy, and I think they will most be remembered for the civil nuclear agreement that really turned what had been the most significant irritant in our bilateral relations, which was nuclear nonproliferation, particularly after India exploded a nuclear weapon in 1998, and turned it into a real opportunity for cooperation to help meet India's growing energy needs, also to help our companies, and again, provide a real opportunity for India to become an ally in the global nonproliferation effort, which they have indeed become. President Obama has called India our indispensable partner for the 21st century. And that's why he and Secretary Clinton are now forging a new strategic partnership with India that we really do believe is going to help to shape the 21st century. India's strategic importance to the United States, I think, reflects a lot of different factors. First, I think you know that the center of gravity for U.S. foreign policy is shifting from Europe to Asia. We now have 1/3 more trade with Asia than we do with Europe. And India, if you look at kind of the broad span of where we have our greatest challenges around the world, they go from North Korea to the Middle East. And right in the middle of that span of countries is this great big democracy of India that wants to work more closely with the United States. India is also a very young country. At a time when much of the rest of the industrialized world is facing declining birth rates, half of India's population is still under the age of 25. As I said earlier, it's the world's second fastest growing economy, and our own National Intelligence Council has projected that India's economy will be the 3rd largest in the world by 2025, so in just 15 years. In remarking on the implications of India's growth for U.S. business, Larry Summers told the U.S.-India Business Council earlier this year that the India of 2040 may well be a nation of over 1 billion people with middle-class living standards. Finally, within Asia, no other country has the democracy, the economic promise, and the growing record of economic cooperation and broader cooperation than India. Under Secretary of State William Burns, I think, really summed it up best in a recent speech that he gave at the Council on Foreign Relations. And he said, Never has there been a moment when India and America mattered more to one another. And never has there been a moment when partnership between India and America mattered more to the rest of the globe. As two of the world's leading democracies, we can help build a new global commons, an international system in which other democracies can flourish, human dignity is advanced, poverty is reduced, trade is expanded, the spread of weapons of mass destruction is curbed, violent extremists are marginalized, and new frontiers in science and technologies are explored. That is the moment and the promise that lies before us. And that's why President Obama hosted Prime Minister Singh to the White House last year for the very first official state visit of the Obama administration. And that's when he called the U.S.-India relationship one of the defining partnerships of the 21st century. As part of the effort to give more definition to the partnership, President Obama and Secretary Clinton established a strategic dialogue with India last year, which convened for the first time in June. And the purpose of that dialogue is really to give senior-level strategic direction to the many different working groups and dialogues that we already have in progress. I think we have a total of 18 with the Indians. And to conceive new initiatives that will further propel our two countries towards prosperity. That dialogue has already cemented closer cooperation on education, on agriculture, clean energy, counterterrorism, space exploration, food assistance, and many, many other things. And in a few weeks, in early November, President Obama will make a 3-day visit to India that I think will mark another real milestone in our relations. I know you'd probably like to have me give you a very detailed preview of the visit, but as I said earlier, I don't want to get too much into the details and trump the president of what he's going to say. But let me just give you a sort of a broad outline of how of the issues that are going to frame this visit and how we think this is going to benefit Americans. As we work with our Indian friends to plan the visit, I think there are going to be 3 cross-cutting themes that will illustrate the breadth and depth of our partnership. First, the visit will illustrate how India's economic rise has created new opportunities for mutually beneficial economic partnerships between our new knowledge-based economies. In thinking about the emergence of developing powers, you think about China, Brazil, or even Turkey, you tend to focus on how the growth of these nations could sometimes adversely affect economic conditions here in the United States. But a recent study by India's Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry showed that Indian firms are investing almost as much here in the United States as their American counterparts are in India. During the 2004 to 2008 or 2009 period, 90 Indian companies made 127 greenfield investments worth $5.5 billion. They created 16,000 new jobs, and they also there were also deals in various kinds of acquisitions. There, the total value was $21 billion, or about 78 million per acquisition. A lot of you are familiar with some of the headline ones. The Tata Company bought the Plaza Hotel in New York, but there are many, many others like that. A new poll conducted by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs shows that Americans have an increasingly favorable view of India, and that Americans increasingly favor a free trade agreement with India, a figure that has risen almost 9 percentage points in just the last 4 years. As further proof of the benefits that we get from U.S.-India trade, Mukesh Ambani, who is the founder of the huge Indian company Reliance, told the press recently that he expects to create thousands of new jobs in the United States and infuse enormous amounts of capital here to explore for and develop shale gas here in the United States. So the bottom line is that no longer are our economic relations with India a one-way street. The state of Maryland, I think, has a very an important and growing stake in the U.S.-India partnership. Let's take trade. Maryland's state government was so bullish about trade investment opportunities with India that it opened an international business center in Delhi in 2009 to try to attract Indian businesses to come to Maryland and to help promote Maryland exports into India. Governor O'Malley has also presided over annual India-Maryland business gatherings held here over the last several years. I think one particularly attractive area for Maryland companies is going to be in the area of high technology. Last year, high technology products accounted for more than 13% of total trade between the United States and India, and nearly 25% of all U.S. exports to India. Biotechnology, biopharmaceuticals, medical devices, and life sciences are all an increasingly large component of this high-tech trade. According to the recently released Vision 2020, a report that was produced by PricewaterhouseCoopers, and I know there are representatives here today, at the request of India's Department of Industrial Policy, the global biopharmaceutical market could be worth $319 billion by the year 2020. And India hopes to capture at least 10% of that market. So the United States and Indian governments are now working together to lay the groundwork for increased regulatory harmonization and collaboration that will permit our own biotechnology companies to flourish. Of course, the clinical research industry will play a very vital role in this growth, and I think few states are better positioned than Maryland to take advantage of this market. As a hub of biotech, with the J. Craig Ventnor Institute, Johns Hopkins, the National Institute of Health, all located here in the state, Maryland's many small biotechnology firms have much to gain and offer in forming collaborations with their Indian counterparts. India has also contributed substantially to the Human Genome Project and is one of 8 countries participating in the International Rice Genome Project, which aims to map out the genetic structure of rice. These collaborations have the potential to contribute not only to jobs, but can help secure food availability and prevent epidemics around the world. As an example of what is possible, I want to point to one case in the state of Indiana. One of India's leading drug discovery and development companies, Jubilant Life Science, has become an important player in Indiana's economic development. About 100 of Jubilant's 2,300 employees now work at its office in Indianapolis. And that company, which now has annual revenues of $250 million, collaborates with U.S. companies such as Eli Lilly in the Bio Crossroads Public-Private Initiative to promote life sciences and biotechnology in cooperation with the Indiana state government. Between 2001 and 2007, payroll employment in Indiana life sciences industries grew by nearly 3% per year, while employment all across Indiana manufacturing shrank by 2% in each of those years. So life sciences and a lot of the cooperation that took place with India accounted for nearly a quarter of all the job growth in Indiana during that period. And as a result of the work of companies like Jubilant, Indiana is now home to more than 1,600 new businesses in medical devices, pharmaceuticals, drug development, diagnostics, and agricultural biotechnology. The annual wage of a typical life sciences job in Indiana is $82,000, which is more than double the state average. And I think Maryland has very much a similar opportunity and really has a quite natural ecosystem for just this kind of development to take place here. Another area where I think Maryland could benefit a great deal is in the area of education and agricultural cooperation. You all have heard a lot about the growth of the Indian middle class. McKinsey has predicted that India could have as many as 91 million middle-class urban households by the year 2030, up from 22 million today. So each of these families is going to want a TV, an internet service, washers and dryers, cars, and then a huge range of services, all of which could be provided by the United States. As a reflection of middle-class growth, your own Bethesda-based Marriott Hotel is planning to quadruple the number of hotels that it operates in India. This is not just a response to demand by foreign tourists, but also because of the growing middle class in India, they're all traveling and spending in record numbers because of the prosperity there. Another linkage between India's middle class and Baltimore is the McCormick Spice Company, based here, which bought a $35 million, 26% share in the Indian spice maker Eastern Condiments. They've experienced a 25% annual sales growth, which I think has obviously helped McCormick directly, and has also created a huge new market for McCormick inside India. India Globalization Capital, a firm based in Bethesda, has already set out to compete in the rapidly growing Indian infrastructure market by setting up firms in Kerala, in the south, in Nagpur, and in Bangalore. It's the only Indian infrastructure firm here to be listed on the U.S. Stock Exchange. Being here in Baltimore today, which is the center of so many superb educational institutions, I want to acknowledge the symbiosis between education and the growth of the middle class. A strong education system in both the United States and India is going to be the crux of each nation's knowledge-based economy and will help to fuel innovation and facilitate growth for decades to come. Nandan Nilekani, who is the founder of the legendary information technology giant Infosys in India, has estimated that while the working age population of other major economies will be falling over the next decade, India will have an additional 47 million workers coming into the workforce by 2020, almost equal to the shortfall in all of the other world's large economies combined. These legions of Indians entering the workforce for the first time represent an immense economic opportunity, but only if they receive the education and the training that they will need to compete in India's globalizing economy. India's dynamic Minister of Human Resources Development of Education, Kapil Sibal, recently told an audience in New York that India now has 220 million young people who are enrolled in primary and secondary education, only 14 million of whom will have the opportunity to attend college, so roughly 7%. Sibal wants to quadruple that number to 60 million, so from 22 million up to 60 million, so that 60 million can attend colleges in the coming years. He estimates that India is going to need 50,000 new colleges and universities, and that he intends to do that through public-private partnerships. And with the other 150 million people who are not going to attend college, he wants to set up an extensive network of vocational and trade schools to train Indian young people in a wide range of fields for India's fast-growing economy. Minister Sibal and his colleagues know that India cannot meet these challenges alone. And that's why later this year or early next, he hopes to shepherd a bill through India's parliament that for the first time will allow foreign universities to set up campuses in India and offer degrees. That will open significant new opportunities for American universities to develop new partnerships and new research and development opportunities with their Indian counterparts. But we're not waiting for the new legislation. The State Department is already supporting a new partnership between Montgomery College and 3 Indian polytechnics and vocational educational institutions where best practices are already being shared. And we have a lot to share on how to build closer ties between schools and local businesses. The State Department has also launched a new community college initiative for Indian students to earn one-year certificates at key U.S. community colleges. The first cohort of 48 students arrived in India this fall. President Obama's visit will also underscore the importance that we attach to India's growing leadership in Asia and beyond, and how that partnership can help build global security and prosperity. As currently scheduled, the President begins his trip in India and then continues on to Indonesia, South Korea, and Japan. thus situating India in the wider Asian region. Ambassador Shankar discussed how we have already set out to consult with India more closely on all of our strategies in South Asia and the Asia-Pacific region, as well as on topics of global importance, such as nonproliferation, global climate change, and food security. We will see India emerge as a global leader as it occupies a non-permanent seat on the UN Security Council beginning on January 1st of next year for 2 years. We look forward to working with India on critical global issues such as thwarting Iran's nuclear weapons program, fighting piracy in the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea, and reinforcing human rights around the world. We won't always agree on everything, but our common values will ensure that our policies increasingly will mirror each other's. The rise of India's civilian power on the global stage will complement our own efforts at rationalizing foreign policy and emphasizing U.S. civilian power overseas. In an effort to align resources, policies, and strategies, Secretary Clinton introduced last year the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, known as the QDDR. This QDDR will release its very first report soon and will stress the importance of matching traditional diplomacy with innovative engagement that leverages resources and reaches beyond the United States government and uses development strategically. India's broadening influence will reinforce the importance of civilian power. As one example, we hope to partner with India on women's empowerment and agricultural capacity building activities in third countries such as Afghanistan. A remarkable display of using civilian expertise in our 2 countries for the betterment of a third country. In this way, India's formidable civilian workforce will help us rise to the challenges of the 21st century. India also has a growing military role, and we plan to continue a broad array of defense cooperation with them. The United States has put forward both Boeing's F-16 and Bethesda-based Lockheed Martin's F-18 to compete for a new $10 billion tender for medium multi-role combat aircraft that is expected to be shortlisted next year. If either jet wins, we estimate it could bring 27,000 new jobs to the United States. And equally important, it will help to seal our strategic objective of working wing to wing with India to bolster global security and stability. All of these ties demonstrate that cooperation between the United States and India now touches virtually every field of human endeavor, and increasingly is informed and driven by the dynamic business people, scientists, educators, and civil society who are driving change in both of our countries and are bringing our people closer together. It is these enduring people-to-people ties, whether it's the 100,000 Indian students who are already here, the largest single group of foreign students in the United States, or the 2.5 million Indian Americans who are here, who have among the highest per capita incomes of any immigrant group. It is these people that are going to help our 2 governments to strengthen further our strategic partnership and to move our strategic relations forward in the years ahead. So let me conclude again by thanking Frank and everybody here, the Board of Trustees, for your wonderful hospitality. Now that I know you have such a lovely view, I'll be happy to come back and talk about Tajikistan or wherever else you'd like me to talk about. And now let me just open it up to questions. And again, I'd be happy to talk about India, but I'm also happy to talk about Pakistan, Afghanistan. You all know my partner in crime, Ambassador Holbrook, actually manages Afghanistan and Pakistan, but we work very closely on that, and of course, the Central Asia piece. Sir, the question was, can I comment about where Kashmir is going? Well, there are 2 pieces to that. As you know, there's been a sort of simmering violence in Kashmir over the summer. And I think the Indians took some important steps recently to try to address that. They want to reduce the number of military that are there. They have begun to reduce the number of bunkers that are there. They recognize that they've got some serious challenges on their hands there. But I think your question refers more to the broader issue of Indo-Pakistani differences over Kashmir. And I think our sense is, well, first of all, the United States is not at all involved in mediation of any kind. We believe that this is something that needs to be resolved by India and Pakistan themselves, and they will figure out the pace and scope of that. If I can speak for the Indians, I think that they believe that two things need to happen before they can begin to talk about sensitive territorial issues. First is they want to see more progress on the trial of the suspects who are in custody for the murders of 175 people in Mumbai, the famous attacks in November of 2008 that included 6 Americans as well. So there are currently a number of people who are in custody in Pakistan, but India wants to see that trial brought to conclusion and see those people go to jail and punished appropriately. Secondly, India wants to see progress by Pakistan on stopping cross-border infiltration and attacks by Pakistan-based groups. And that's something we want as well. As you all know, Lashkar-e-Taiba was the group that is widely believed to have been responsible for those Mumbai attacks. Lashkar-e-Taiba is now considered by the U.S. State Department and our counterterrorism officials to be the second most deadly threat around the world after Al-Qaeda itself. And in fact, LET frequently cooperates with Al-Qaeda. So this is a very important priority for us as well, because LET increasingly is targeting our troops in Afghanistan in addition to Indians. And so this is a very high priority and something that we are working very closely with the Indians on, and again, trying to work with to encourage the Pakistanis to address this problem in addition to the other challenges they face in the border areas. So if there's progress on that, I think that the Indians would then be prepared to start thinking about widening the dialogue to include some of these other issues. And remember that quite a lot of progress was made between the two countries from 2004 to 2007. But that progress was really predicated on the fact that Pakistan, under General Musharraf at the time, really made a sincere effort to stop the infiltration of militants across that border. And I think it's fair for the Indians to ask the same of the current group in Pakistan. The question is, what's the status of the Commonwealth Games? They're actually almost finished. They're about 2 or 3 days away now. I think they end. And they've gone after a rocky start, to say the least. But they've gone, I think, very well. The Indians have acquitted themselves quite well. I don't think there have been any major complaints by any of the athletes. And so that's largely passed now without major incident. But I think a lot of Indians were embarrassed by the preparations, but it sort of shows both the worst of India and the best of India. It's the worst of India because a lot of people in the government were responsible for the preparations. The best of India because I think the private sector kind of stepped in and really helped and showed themselves to be the kind of thriving leading edge of what I was talking about earlier in my remarks. The question is about the caste system in India and what is being done to sort of ameliorate some of the conditions. That's a very good question. And let me answer it in 2 ways. First of all, I'd say that there's a difference between urban areas and rural areas. I think in urban areas, the caste system is gradually breaking down, and you don't see, for example, as many caste-based marriages as one used to say. That is not the case in rural areas. Rural areas is still very, very strong. It's also the case that in many of what we call the Hindi belt, the Hindu belt that goes west and east of Delhi in the north, in the big states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar and states like that, caste is still very strong. And that caste is still what drives politics in those states. The chief minister of Uttar Pradesh is a woman called Mayawati. And she prides herself on caste-based politics. She doesn't ask, the voters are not asked the question, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? It's all about, what kind of reservations do you have for certain kinds of castes, and I'm going to help you to get more reservations and more privileges based on what your caste is. So there's still a very divisive caste-based politics that exists there, and that's one of the reasons Uttar Pradesh remains one of the poorest states in India, because they're really not focused on these issues of prosperity and spending on health and education and things like that, which is what needs to get done. A really fascinating thing that's occurring, change that's occurring, is in next door to Bihar, to Uttar Pradesh, which is Bihar. Bihar, again, used to be famously one of the poorest states in India. And all of us have always lamented the fact that you can usually tie the levels of poverty with the levels of governance. And these states have often suffered from poor governance. And Bihar has recently gotten a really quite remarkable chief minister by the name of Nitish Kumar, who's made a huge effort and has really turned development and growth around in Bihar in just a very short time. And it just shows the difference that an individual can make if they really apply themselves and begin to try to attract new investment, reduce corruption, reduce crime, invest in infrastructure, invest in health and education. And those are all the things that he's really tried to do. And I think he's really engineered a remarkable turnaround. The question is, how serious are the Maoist rebels, also known as the Naxals, in India? I think they're very serious. They're not going to overthrow the country, but the Naxals are active in kind of the spine of India, in the center part of the country, which is also some of the poorest areas of India. And so they thrive on sort of the lack of opportunities and basically the neglect that those regions have suffered from. So I think the government, under the Home Minister, Mr. Chidambaram, who's a very capable man, have understood that they need to take a holistic approach to this, and that this is a very serious threat for them. If you listen to the speeches that Mr. Chidambaram gives, he will say very clearly that more Indian security forces have been killed by the Naxals than by any terrorist threat from Pakistan. And so that is really kind of their most serious domestic problem. But it's also something they're prepared to deal with. We don't really cooperate with them at all on the Naxal challenge. Again, it's mostly a question of improving governance, improving investment in those areas, making sure that those people have opportunities and that they're not neglected. And I think the government is committed to that, but India's got still huge challenges. 700 million people still live on less than $2 a day in many parts of India. And so it's a question of how you prioritize where you're going to help. The question was, why does China dominate trade with the United States and not India? And I think it's really a difference between their models of growth. China's pattern China's model of growth is really export-led growth. And so they've had a great success in attracting American companies to come in and invest and then export out of China, and has hurt our trade deficit considerably. India has pursued a much more inward consumption-led growth based on consumption inside India. And it also has freed up its own private sector. If you look at any measure of the number of millionaires around the world, India has a very large number of millionaires. China has a very few, actually. Same with the number of competitive companies around the world. I mentioned earlier in my speech about acquisitions and some of the really important investments that Indian companies are making here. That's all a reflection of the kind of dynamic and vibrant and highly competitive private sector inside India, and which has been relatively open compared to China, which is, again, much more closed because of currency convertibility and many other issues that you're all familiar with. So, I think that's the main difference. And the other thing that's quite interesting about India that many of you may not realize, but unlike almost every country, developing country around the world, India has developed, more than half of its GDP comes from knowledge-based industries of one sort or another. Information technology and pharmaceuticals and all of those things. Whereas the conventional path to growth is usually through more labor-intensive kind of manufacturing. Only now is that manufacturing starting to take hold in India, and only now are you beginning to see American companies like Ford and a huge range of others who are beginning to invest. And that's largely because the market itself in India is large enough now that they can not only invest for the Indian market, but then once those investments are in place, they're then looking to export out as well. So Ford is supplying the local market, but also exporting, has a huge business exporting spare parts out of India to various parts of the world. The question is, if India were to meet the two conditions, if Pakistan were to meet the two conditions that I described earlier, could India be persuaded to relinquish Kashmir? Well, it depends what you mean by Kashmir itself. There are a lot of different components to it. There's the famous Sur Creek, there's the Siachen Glacier, there's the Kashmir Valley itself. As I said,
Kashmir Valley is the heart of it.
Yeah. I think, coming back to my earlier comments about how the two countries made a lot of progress between 2004 and 2007, they did so not only through sort of formal foreign ministry to foreign ministry talks, but also through much more sensitive back-channel talks that took place. And in those back-channel talks, they made quite a lot of progress on a lot of these territorial issues, to the point where they almost reached agreement on how to divide Kashmir. And I think most experts believe that the current, what's called the line of control, the current effective border, would become the international border, and that over time, they would, both countries, assuming there's not too much violence, both countries would agree to demilitarize on both sides of the border reciprocally, and there would be some sort of arrangement whereby the inhabitants on both sides of the line of control would have special trade and passage privileges, so they could go back and forth much more freely than other Indians and Pakistanis from the rest of the country. And that there would be kind of greater autonomy given by each of the respective governments to those regions. So the answer to your question is probably not, that the existing arrangement is what most people judge to be what's likely to be the eventual outcome. But as I said earlier, neither country is now prepared to really talk about that until some of these other issues are sorted out. And again, a level of trust has been built up again so that they can begin to tackle what is certainly the most sensitive issue on their bilateral agenda. The question was about the Indian-Russia defense cooperation, and particularly India has always been heavily reliant on Russian arms of various kinds. And I think to a certain extent, India still is reliant on Russian arms of various kinds, but that's slowly beginning to change. In part because we have the best and most advanced defense systems in the world, as everyone knows. And we are now beginning this very sensitive process of looking at our export control policy. And over time, as India's own non-proliferation record has improved, we have been willing to relax a lot of the restrictions on high technology trade. As I mentioned in my speech, a lot of high technology trade, including in the defense area, has really expanded quite rapidly in recent years. You may have heard Secretary Gates speak about this, where he believes that our export control globally are very outdated. He likes to joke that you can get things in Radio Shack that are still on our strategic trade controls list, and that it just points to the fact that the system is fallen behind where industry is on these things. And he's right, of course. So one of the things that I think you're going to see coming out of the president's visit is further progress on this export control thing. And particularly in the defense side, we believe that there actually are some quite significant opportunities to begin developing new technologies and doing more production inside India for the first time. And I think the multi-role combat aircraft and some other big sales that we're talking about are really going to illustrate that in let's say the next year or two when these things are decided. Now, we hope, of course, that American companies are going to be chosen. Obviously, if they're not chosen, that kind of stuff won't occur. But again, we think we have the best product, and certainly they're widely acknowledged around the world by our partners as being the best products. Both Boeing and Lockheed are competing for this sale, but there are a huge number of other sales. Another one that's coming up very soon is for C-17s, which are the largest lift aircraft in the world. And one of the reasons that the United States is the first responder in natural disasters around the world, or any disaster, is that we're one of the few countries in the world that have lift capabilities to get people and things to fast into places that need it. So the Indians want to buy 10 of these, which is a very large purchase. That'd be about a $4 billion purchase. And we hope to be able to finalize that if possible. And that would be a major new opportunity, not only in terms of our own exports and jobs and so forth, but also in terms of working more closely with the Indians on disaster management. Because frankly, we don't want to have to always bear the burden of being the first responders everywhere around the world. And if we could work more closely with people like the Indians who want to do more, that would really benefit us. The question, it was about infrastructure. That China, one of the reasons that China has always been able to move ahead so quickly is that they have a command economy, and they can order things to be done, and they're done. Whereas India has a famously slow and inefficient bureaucracy and crumbling infrastructure, and it's much more difficult to get things done in India. All of those things are true. But so the question is, can India kind of change, and can they make things better? And I think the answer is yes. And the simple reason that India now has the resources and now has the will to do this. Manmohan Singh, who is now the prime minister, was the finance minister in the early 1990s, and he put in place the market reforms that have now triggered the growth that you're seeing, the 7, 8, 9% growth that you're seeing. That growth started really in about 2003, and has been sustained ever since. There was a little bit of a blip during the global recession, but even then it only went down to, I think, a little under 7%. So they were still growing pretty fast. And so that growth has given the Indians tremendous resources to begin to really focus on some of these problems that you're talking about. They are planning to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure upgrades of all kinds. If you fly into any Indian airport now, you will see tremendous building projects everywhere, in Mumbai and Delhi, every major airport, and a lot of the regional airports as well. Same for the roads, same for everything. The Delhi Metro has just been built, and it's quite an impressive undertaking. So a lot of very important investment is taking place, and they understand that they are not going to be able to compete in the global economy unless they have that basic infrastructure. But the bureaucracy is still an issue, and I think that was shown during the Commonwealth Games. And there still is corruption, and those are things that have to be dealt with. But what's important in India is that there is a democracy, and there's a free press, there are opposition politicians, and many other NGO, non-governmental organizations and civil society activists, all of whom are pointing to all those problems and pushing to get them fixed. Whereas in China, of course, you don't have that system. So I think that's a major difference. How are they going to pay for all this investment and so forth that they're making? What's their tax structure? I think that the tax structure has been a weakness, but they are addressing that now, and particularly the businesses are paying more taxes, and of course that's where the growth is coming from. And then, as I mentioned, these 300 million people or so who are in the middle class are paying more taxes. So all of that, of course, is generating revenues. But then the major is still through indirect taxation, and that's where, as in many countries, that's where you're going to see, customs taxes and things like that are regressive, of course. But that's how they're much easier to collect than. So the question is, how prepared are the Indians to deal with a lot of the big environmental problems that they face? I think that as growth has occurred and as more and more Indians travel, they understand the importance of dealing with environmental issues. And there are now a number, as in our country in the 1970s, where we were just beginning to enact the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and all the kind of landmark environmental legislation that we are now proud of. India's at that kind of stage now. They're at the stage where there's a growing understanding within the population of the importance of protecting the environment. There's an understanding that there's huge challenges that have to be met. There is an active civil society and environmental groups and so forth who are working to change. And most importantly of all, there's a court system that works. I'll give you one example. When I was there in Delhi in 2003, there was a very important public interest lawsuit that was brought by a group of concerned citizens. And they went straight to the Indian Supreme Court and they said, the health of our children is being affected by the high levels of lead in all of the municipal vehicles in Delhi, which is a city of 28 million people. The state of Delhi is 28 million people. So their suit was to force the government to install clean natural gas and to require all of the three-wheeled scooters, all of the buses, all the trucks, all the municipal fleet to use compressed natural gas. And the Supreme Court agreed, and they forced them to do it. And air quality improved dramatically in Delhi. Now, of course, that's been undermined by the fact that because of all this middle class, everybody's buying more cars. So, so they got to deal with that. But the point is, I think there is an environmental conscience now. They've been quite good partners with us on climate change, for example. So this is going to be a work in progress. But I think that you'll begin to see more of this. I have several friends who work in the environmental movement who are doing much more in India now to work with their counterparts, but also work with the government. So, like I said, I think India's at the stage where we were maybe 20 or 30 years ago, and there's a great deal of public attention to this now, and I think the government is beginning to move on this. We talk about all these educational opportunities. How do we expect the Indians to be able to pay for an American education? And the answer is that a lot of the American universities hope to go over to India and establish partnerships there and campuses there, and they would charge the going rate there. They're not going to charge $42,000 like an Ivy League education, because of course that would be well beyond the means of any Indian. But the other thing they do is increasingly you find partnerships where the Indian students will spend 3 years at a campus in India, and then they'll do a last year at a campus in the United States. So most of their expenses will be borne in India and living and those kind of things. And then the very last year, they'll go overseas for their final year. Many of them have, scholarship opportunities of one sort or another. But, frankly, a lot of these people now in the middle class, they have money. They can afford to come to the United States. And that's why there are 100,000 Indian students here, because, they have disposable income, and we welcome that. The question was about Bangladesh and how are relations between the United States and Bangladesh, and how are relations between Bangladesh and India. Bangladesh is really one of the kind of sleeper success stories in my area. They had their freest and fairest elections in November of 2008, and they have become quite an important partner for us. President Obama has a number of kind of signature global initiatives. He has one on to feed the future. He has one on global Muslim engagement. He has another one on climate change, and he has another one on global health. Bangladesh is partnering with us on every single one of those in a serious way. Sheikh Hasina, who's the current Prime Minister of Bangladesh, was recently honored at the UN. There's a particular focus now on what they call the Millennium Development Goals, to try to significantly reduce poverty between the year 2000 and the year 2015. So this was a good year in the year 2010 to measure how we're doing and how the world is doing at these Millennium Development Goals. And Bangladesh was recognized for the progress that it's made on its development goals. Bangladesh is a country we all think of as sort of the basket case of, and kind of the poster child of starvation and deprivation and so forth. And that is really not the case anymore. They've had growth of an average growth rate of 6% over the last 20 years, which, when you think about it, is quite an impressive achievement. They've made tremendous progress in reducing child mortality. They've made tremendous progress in reducing the number of people that need food assistance of one sort or another. So they're really doing quite well, and they're a country now that really wants to reach out and help. They have the largest peacekeeping forces in the world. They are also, as I mentioned earlier, some of the things that we're doing, they're also working with us a little bit in Afghanistan. They've got some of their own non-governmental organizations that are there. They're helping on health and education in Afghanistan. So on the India-Bangladesh side, it's also very positive. Sheikh Hasina has always kind of valued her relations with the Indians. One of the first things she did when she came into office was to contact Prime Minister Singh and say that she wanted to try to improve relations. And they have begun in a very serious way to work together on things like counterterrorism cooperation, which is really important, Because if you're the Lashkar-e-Taiba, and the border between Pakistan and India is increasingly well patrolled, and there's a fence there now, it's more and more difficult to get across that border. So they're going to try to get through Nepal, through Bangladesh. So it's very important that those two countries also have good cooperation with the Indians on counterterrorism. The Bangladeshis have really stepped up in a serious way, and I think in a very helpful way. They're also talking about things like water, which is unheard of for those two countries to talk about. So there's a lot of progress being made. To be sure, there's still huge poverty. It's still a country, every single year there's some natural disaster of epic proportions that affects their country. Floods coming down from the Himalayas. So they still have a lot of challenges, but with what few resources they have, they've done extremely well. The question was that I mentioned that a lot of Indian students have come here, but traditionally a lot of them have stayed. And so is that still true? As the gentleman said, that is the case. In the 60s and 70s and 80s and even 90s, really the cream of India's educational elite came to our country. And why did they come to our country? Because we had, particularly the graduate level education that they frankly just didn't have in India at that time. And once they'd gone through that graduate level education, there wasn't really anything for them to go back to. India was still largely a state-driven import substitution economy. So there were not large opportunities for very smart engineers and people like that. So they just stayed here in the United States, and we were the beneficiary of that. I mean, they have become, as I say, one of the most successful ethnic groups in the United States. Now that's changed. And that really began to change while I was there in 2003, 2004, 2005. And the reason it changed was because there are opportunities now. And those same young Indians are still coming here, and they're still going to all the Ivy League schools and everything else. And then they'll get a 1 or 2 year temporary visa, like what's called an H visa. And they'll go work on Wall Street, or they'll go work somewhere. And then they go back, because there's such major opportunities now. And if you look at in areas like Gurgaon outside of Delhi, or in Bangalore and Hyderabad, there are all these little startup companies. A great many of those are startup companies by Indians who came back from the United States. They have a little capital that they earned in those last 2 years, but most importantly, they have the know-how and they have the contacts from the United States to really begin these biotechnology, information technology, and all kinds of other things. And that's really driving a lot of the growth now in India. And it's really great to see that. And it's something obviously we encourage.
This has been an extraordinarily valuable evening, and we certainly thank the ambassador for it. Thank you so much.